Okay, so good evening, everyone. Pleased to be joined by Chatterji tonight to discuss her book, The Lucknow Residency, which I have here. This is a copy, my one. We're going to go through the book. We're not gonna spoil it, but we're certainly going to try and sell it to you and show the appeal of this book. And if you've got a trip to Lucknow in mind, I think you'd be silly not to have this in your luggage. So firstly, an introduction to Barnthorne Publishing. Myself and Neil Thornton set up Barnthorne Publishing last September. It's been a roller coaster journey since then. We've been thrilled to be inundated with authors and requests for books to be published. And yeah, we're going strength to strength, and it's really credit to our growing team of authors that we're working with. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Eva to introduce herself and give us a little bit about her background.
Well, as you know, my name is Eva Chatterji. I wrote this book to state the obvious, but my background is mainly in India. I grew up in India and in Bangladesh, so my interest in this area has been pretty much something of a lifetime. I started researching the mutiny when I was 16. So it's been a long, long journey to actually get to this point. And the book came from all those years and years of traveling and reading and researching and finding out new things and various trips to Lucknow. So that's where it came from.
Great. How many times have you been to Lucknow so far?
I have been to Lucknow a grand total of, let me see, the very first trip would have been way back in 1996. So it has been 7, 8 journeys since then, 9 journeys since then, at various times of the year. I usually go in the summer when nobody goes, because I like to experience things as they did, you know. It's nothing to do with the fact I like the monsoons. It's more to do with the fact that I really did want to see how miserable it was in the middle of June. And I have found out personally how miserable it was. So it's just, you know, part of the experience of visiting Lucknow. It is a very, very interesting city. And that site has never quite left my imagination. It's always lurking somewhere in the background. So it was a very personal journey that I went on with this book.
Indeed. I mean, you mentioned the weather and the conditions. I think that's something that really comes across in the book is the hardship. And we'll kind of come on to these various subjects later on. But you know, this wasn't a kind of a Rorke's Drift scenario where most of the people there were fighters basically. There were a lot of women, children caught up in all of this, and they all played their individual roles, which we'll come on to. Indeed, there were a lot of kind of non-military personnel who volunteered and picked up arms and joined in the defence. So they were literally fighting for their lives. So yeah, we'll pick up on these themes as we go through. But winding it back slightly, so obviously this is your first book with Barnthorne. So obviously congratulations. So how did this journey start? Because obviously this was a book you'd written prior to speaking to us.
Mm-hmm. Well, the journey started actually when I went to Lucknow on one visit in 2003, when I went with a other book. It was a book written by Edward Hilton, The Very Last Guide to the Lucknow Residency, published in 1934, originally published in 1899. And he had been a little boy, or a young man during the time of the mutiny. He was 13 years old, serving with Martinia post. And he wrote this book. And I thought, well, I'll take his book and see how it compares to the modern times, only to find out that the site was, well, it was impossible to find out what was happening. There was no signage. There was a very poor map, and no one really quite knew anything about it. Even the people who were there were mildly confused. I mean, they really did not know what the site was about. So this kind of annoyed me, I must say. I was a little bit like, well, this is not really fair for all the people who come here they will have never a clue of what they've actually seen. They get taken to the residency, shown a few broken buildings, and then taken back out again, which seemed a little bit unfair. So I thought, well, no, we can change that. So I was actually using Hilton's book as my first template for this, to bring a little bit of this back to life, and to show that this was not a siege, as you said. It's not Rorke's Drift. You know, there's a lot of facets in the Lucknow Residency which people have forgotten, whether it's the suffering of the women and the children, or just the sheer horror of being stuck in a place, never knowing if you're ever going to come out alive. And if one has the guidebook or has an idea of what happened, you can appreciate the site a lot better. So that was where I was coming from with this.
Definitely, and I think it's fair to say, quite a few people probably have heard of Lucknow. I think if you've got an interest, particularly in military history or Indian history, you've probably heard of it. And I myself had, but I had no knowledge of the layout of this this siege, etc. And obviously, I'm just going to hold up the book. So one of the diagrams we've got in the book is the outline of the the perimeter, if you like, that they were defending. And you can literally, on a building by building basis, see that every inch of real estate was being leveraged to some to some purpose. And as you go through the book, you see how these different buildings and locations bear relevance. So would you like to give a bit of an outline in terms of how the book is set up, like what the kind of sections of the book are?
Well, the book is divided into different sections. It starts off with a history, a basic history of how the siege came about in Lucknow. I've deliberately not put too much about 1857 in it, because that is a much larger subject than can be covered by a guidebook. I mean, there's an awful lot out there which we can read, and it's good if one reads a little bit about 1857 to understand the larger concept of what the mutiny was about. But it starts off with that. There's also an outline of all the main events of 1857, in case anyone wants to have that kind of background. And then how we came to that point, how we actually came to having a siege. So we have the Battle of Chinhat, which is the 30th of June, and then we go straight into the siege. And the siege starts from that point onwards. And the book then gives an outline of all the different posts, which are either visible in the compound or not visible. I included the ones which are not visible because otherwise the map makes no sense, because one could be walking past an empty field and thinking, oh, an empty field. Yeah. And I'm thinking, no, that was a post. So it's important to see this to have that visual reference of the map, and then see that every single piece of ground there was being used for something. And after that, after the tour part of the book, it goes into how life was during the siege. And that is to give people an idea of this being a battle, well, of people. It was, it's difficult to understand. There were 2,994 people in the beginning of the siege, and 930 people walked out. Yeah. And when we look at those numbers, we kind of have to see that there was an awful lot that went on here besides a couple of boys with a few muskets. Yeah. There was an awful lot more going on. And, this is only counting the people who were considered Europeans. They don't talk about the Indian casualties of this, or the servants, the camp followers, the workers, the people who didn't run away or didn't manage to get away. So that figure of 930 is a little bit deceptive. There might have been, probably there were more people who survived, but 930 is the final count of who walked out of 2,994, and that's pretty grim.
Yeah, and I think obviously after that section you mentioned about life in the siege, one of the appendix basically is a list of person by person, what their fates were, where known, lots of information there. And it's that really brings it home that quite often with history you can attribute numbers to something, and oh yeah, there was 500 died. But when you actually read, oh well, John Smith died, he got shot in the head by a musket ball, it really does obviously put meat on the bone, so to speak. So I think that also, as you said about the European to Indian ratio, that's obviously that's included in here. You've got the order of battle basically, and you go through the different units, and then there's a note about obviously how that relates to the Indian presence. And I've just found the page at the right moment. The Indian soldiers outnumbered the Europeans by a ratio of 10-1. So yeah, it really brings home the point. So yeah, I think that makes complete sense about the structure of the book, and I think the key to this is, as you say, it's a book it's not the history of the Indian Mutiny of 1857 or of Lucknow. Indeed, it's very targeted book, and that's what we've worked with you to obviously create. Is this book is for a purpose. It gives you a guide, even if you're not fortunate enough to visit Lucknow. If you read this book, maybe get Google Maps open, you'll definitely have a much better sense of the battlefield, as such, much more than you would otherwise. So I think, yeah, you've done a great job with that. In terms of the locations, so we were speaking about this before we came on. Sorry, just someone in the waiting room, just letting them in. Yeah, we're speaking about locations beforehand, and you've mentioned that unfortunately the passage of time has claimed some of the buildings or locations. Aesthetically they can look very different to what they would have looked like, and obviously in the book you've got that then and now aspect. You've got kind of representations or illustrations of what these places would have looked like at the time, where possible. And then you've got your photographs from your trips, which really give that stark contrast. So, what would you say is, and this might be putting you on the spot, but what would you say is your kind of favourite location or locations within, within the residency?
Well, one of my favorite locations within the residency, I think, is the Banqueting Hall. During the siege, it was used as the hospital, and it stands just behind the Bellegarde Gate, above the treasury. One has to imagine the residency is basically on a hill. When you walk in, you go up a slight hill. So then there's lower positions, and then there's the ones which are higher up. And the residency was one of the higher positions at the front of the complex. And it was during the siege, there would have been these very large windows that were barricaded by boards. Everything was shut up by boxes, and when one walks in there today, it still has this very melancholy aspect to it. One really gets the sense of something almost ghostly in the Banqueting Hall. That's where they brought their wounded. That's where the dead were taken away from. That's where the widows went when they could. They served as nurses. They went there to try and help. And it still somehow carries the echoes of this very, very, well, yeah, I guess melancholy. It's a very stark building. It's very large. I mean, one doesn't realize, the pictures don't really give it much credit, but these buildings are very big. And the Banqueting Hall would have been 2 stories tall. And when one looks up now, one can see a fireplace. There we go. One can see a fireplace with a big gaping hole in it. Yeah. And you think, my goodness, so that's all the way up there. It's way above my head. Yeah. And it gives you very much this feeling of what this was. It's one of the few completely intact buildings. There's 5 in all, which are reasonably intact. And but this one really gives you the sense of what was happening. Especially with all the damage in it. It's quite phenomenal. So I do spend a lot of time in the Banqueting Hall when I'm there. Yeah.
No, I'm going to show you the photo again. So this is the kind of the before, if you like. As you say, you don't quite get the scale of the building, but there's a couple of stories, like you say. And then this is your kind of modern equivalent.
Exactly.
And as you say, in contrast to a lot of the sites, that's probably one of the best preserved ones. So yeah, no, that's great. And I guess in terms of the, some of the stories. So each of these locations, has their own stories. It had their own people that were either there for the majority of the time, or obviously some people moved around a little bit. Is there any other locations which come to mind, to highlight at this point?
Well, I think the other one, of course, is always going to be it's always going to be the graveyard. There you can really get a sense of the personal damage of such a siege. And it's a very interesting place just to wander around in. There's not much left of the church, but that was to be expected. The church was battered into infinity already during the siege. The other place, of course, would be Dr. Fair's house. Dr. Fair's house stands right there opposite the Banqueting Hall, and it is very well preserved. And it's also the place where Henry Lawrence died. He was shot in the Residency, but he died at Fair's house. And his room is still there, preserved with a plaque. This is the room where Henry Lawrence died, or something along those lines. And one can walk through the entire house. And there's even a map in the book which shows what the house would have looked like before, and a ground plan. So one can really take that and look at the house and walk through the house, which is quite an experience, trying to find out all the different locations in the house.
Yeah, there's a plan. Obviously, please buy the book, everyone, and you can have a closer look. But there's a plan of the book, like you say.
Mm-hmm. So yes, those places are very evocative of the siege itself. I mean, obviously the residency building stands there, tall and proud still today, and it is quite an amazing building. It's an absolute warren of rooms and staircases, and yeah, it's quite an impressive building itself. So it's basically everything's quite worth looking at. But if from favorites, it would still be the Banqueting Hall, and I think Fair's house. Fair's house
Mm.
gave me so much trouble trying to figure out where the rooms were according to his plan. So if one really has an hour or two to kill, then try it. It's fun.
So I'm going to go back on a couple of points you mentioned. So obviously you talk about the graveyard. So we were talking beforehand, and the graveyard isn't quite as it seems in terms of
Mm.
its current layout. So do you want to go into that a little bit?
Well, the graveyard has gone through some transformations. I mean, there are monuments that were built later after the siege. For example, the monument to the first Madras Fusiliers has gone from being a simple square box to being a tremendous tower, which was then brought later. So there have been changes over time as it went on. Some monuments were made more elaborate, some were um, added because grave locations were not necessarily known. I mean, the markers are not necessarily where the person was buried, because that was not always, when they were buried, basically they were chucked in a hole and dirt was thrown over them, and sometimes a stick was put there to say, hey, this guy was buried here. So people made it up as they went along. Some of the stones were placed later by relatives. But what has happened recently, they have started a program of renovation at the residency. And I used the map that I had in Mr. Hilton's book of the plan of the graveyard to mark out the graves for myself. So I know who was buried when, I can walk around and see everyone. But with the renovations, unfortunately, a lot of these graves suddenly developed legs and wandered off somewhere else. So they've turned up in the oddest places. Many of them were broken. A lot of graves no longer exist, or there's just a stone with nothing on it. So the renovations that they've done, they've also managed to paint everything pink, which was a very odd color choice, personally. Yeah, but so it has lost a little bit of the gloomy side of a cemetery, and turned more into a nicely spruced up and cleaned up place where one can wander around. It just doesn't have the character it used to have. So I would, I think if people are expecting to find a dilapidated cemetery, they won't. It
Mm.
has been spruced up, but unfortunately it's been spruced up almost to the point of being unrecognizable, which is slightly sad. And they've done similar renovations all around the residency. So I'm kind of hoping that, with Indian weather will do a little bit to dampen their spirits, and add some moss and maybe muck up the paint a bit because it is a little bit bright on the eyes at the moment.
Yeah.
So there's renovation and restoration. I think they've kind of skipped into the let's make it pretty as opposed to let's preserve it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting you said about before we came on about the they're patching up some of the kind of the bullet
Yeah.
marks, the cannon shell holes, etc. And you think, well, if it's not like they're redeveloping the site for anything, so there's no real need to do that.
No.
It just seems a bit pointless.
Yeah, it does seem pointless. There was no need for that. I mean, I don't know what they're planning in the future. I really don't. But I think they are taking away some of the interest of it by patching up the parts that people want to see. I mean, it's the first time I went there, there were holes in walls that were so big you put your head through them. Yeah. And I think those need to stay where they are. They have been keeping those, but what they've done is they smoothed out the edges, so you don't get the roughness anymore. Yeah, which is okay because you're no longer scratching your neck when you're putting your head through it. But but still, it's not the point. The point is to keep it. When the British left in 1947, and the Union Jack was taken down from the Residency for the last time, the buildings have been preserved in their exact position in the exact same way since the last day of the Siege of Lucknow, which ended in November 1857. So for nearly 90 years, the place had stayed as it was, and it continued to stay as it was until they began these rather odd and unusual renovations. There was not much point for it. These buildings would have stayed there as they were, and maybe it would have been better to just let them crumble away as they're supposed to, rather than slopping pink paint on them and saying, "Hey, look, this is what we have." It's a little bit jarring, but on the other hand, if it helps to preserve the place for another 100 years, then maybe their decisions were right. Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously scarily, we're probably not a million miles off 200 years
Yeah,
anniversary.
exactly.
So yeah, it's always a balance, isn't it? Like you say. One of the names you mentioned was Lawrence. So we're going to assume that no one knows who Lawrence is. I do because I've read the book. But do you want to give a little intro to Lawrence?
Well, Sir Henry Lawrence was sent to Lucknow as the commissioner. He was there to oversee the mess that they'd left behind after the annexation of the province of Awadh in 1856. Unfortunately, Henry Lawrence arrived rather late. He arrived in March 1857, when it was already too late to remedy some of the damage that had been done by the annexation. The annexation basically booted out the king. They packed him off to Calcutta, and gave Awadh under the control of the East India Company, and they were no longer independent as they had been. And the reasons and the reasoning for that was possibly warped, but that's a topic for another time. But Sir Henry Lawrence was a very experienced administrator. He had been in the Punjab before, and he had actually written the code for Punjab after the Sikh Wars. So he had been very much involved in Indian politics and the politics of annexation for quite some time. So he knew what he was about. And when he arrived in Lucknow, he was under no illusions. He had been reading the signs for some time that there was something wrong. And when the outbreak happened in Meerut, for him it was perfectly clear that would not be very long before Lucknow explodes. So he'd started taking up a lot of responsibility, besides trying to calm the whole entire situation down, which he actually managed to do quite well. He started reinforcing the residency. He started gathering supplies. He started putting people together, telling them, look, it's just a matter of time. We're all going to be in a lot of trouble. So, gather your women and children, send them in here, and we'll do what we can. We're going to have to save ourselves. And so that's what he started to do. He organized his army. He organized the volunteers. He tried his best to make sure that they could withstand a siege. Whether they would survive a siege was something else, but he was going to try his level best to make sure they would at least have a fighting chance. So Henry Lawrence was quite a remarkable man, and a remarkable administrator. I mean, one should really read biographies of him to understand the depth of the man. I mean, he had a lot going on and a tremendous understanding for India at the time, and vast experience of India at the time. I mean, for our time, we wouldn't understand a man like Henry Lawrence, but then he was a needed man. But unfortunately, he didn't even make it past the first week of the siege of Lucknow. He was shot. And he died a rather gruesome and horrible death. But his gravestone was dictated by him. He said, here lies Sir Henry Lawrence, who tried to do his duty, which is pretty much a sum of the man himself. He tried, and he wasn't going to give himself any airs and graces about it. So that was Sir Henry Lawrence.
Yeah, I think obviously his greatest contribution was probably before anything happened, in the sense of the siege itself. So the fact he died early, he'd already probably played a massive part, proportionally to that. So yeah, no, very, very interesting character. While we're on the subject of interesting characters, so throughout the book, you mentioned several VC recipients for the VCs awarded at Lucknow. Do you want to talk about one or two of those?
Sure. And all for the Lucknow Residency, we have to kind of differentiate between VCs for Lucknow and VCs for the Lucknow Residency, because for Lucknow itself, that would have been about 75 VCs. But for the residency itself, there were only 6 indirect association with the residency, plus one, which was a rather entertaining character named Sir Thomas Henry Kavanagh. But yes, there were remarkably very few Victoria Crosses awarded for the residency. So these are mentioned in the book because one can walk into the residency and basically feel this is where they won their Victoria Cross. And that's something rather interesting to think. Here they were, and this is what they were defending, and this is what they were working towards. There would have probably been a lot more Victoria Crosses awarded, but unfortunately, a lot of those fellows, they didn't make it. But yes, there were 2 that really do stand out. For me, one of them is Corporal William Oxenham of the 32nd Regiment, who saved a man named Mr. Capper. Now, Mr. Capper was a civilian, and Mr. Capper had had no experience with the military before. And when the siege ended, he made absolutely sure he had nothing to do with them afterwards either. But Mr. Capper was based at Captain Anderson's post, which is a very exposed building, which got a tremendous battering right from the very start. They were right up by the walls. They were getting battered to nothing. And Captain Anderson's house had very large verandas. And one of these verandas fell down. And Mr. Capper happened to get buried under an awful lot of rubble. Now, he was a very lucky man because the way the pillars fell, they didn't fall directly on him. They fell sort of around and between him. So he was buried, but not crushed. But there were people who were shouting, he's dead. We can't save him. But Corporal Oxenham, who happened to be also at Anderson's post, and the captain himself decided, no, we're going to get Mr. Capper out. So they dug Mr. Capper out. In 45 minutes, laying on their stomachs, working with 2 hands, they were digging the man out of the rubble, as Mr. Capper keeps yelling, more air, more air. But they managed to get him out. They pulled him out. They were being shot at. They were being, attacked from all sides. They had a very small wall to protect themselves, to hide behind as they're digging out Mr. Capper. So, Oxenham was quite a remarkable character because, he carried on then. Afterwards, he just carried on throughout the rest of the siege, doing other amazing things, but it was the saving of Mr. Capper that won him his Victoria Cross. And
yeah, I was going to say that's a great, is one of the great stories of the book, really, that individual courage to do that under fire, save a life.
And without even thinking about the consequences for himself. I mean, he could very well have lost his head. But it was, it was that point in time, Mr. Capper was the man they were going to save, and he was going to do it, no matter what anyone thought. Yeah. And of course, the second Victoria Cross that always stands out in my mind when I think about Lucknow has to be Kavanagh. Yeah. Thomas Henry Kavanagh, the civilian who never stopped. He was a very complex character in many ways. He was a man who felt he was destined for something much, much, much greater than what he was, a civilian. He wanted to be something wonderful. And the Siege of Lucknow gave him everything he wanted, up to the point where he decided that he was going to be the one who was going to bring the final relief of Lucknow to their doors, disguised himself in the most as a ridiculous way possible, and with a guide who must have been horrified. They ran out of the residency at night, swam across a ditch, dashed through the town, and eventually made it with the papers and the map to the camp of Sir Colin Campbell. And then Kavanagh led Campbell and the rest of the force, not him on his own. There were other people who were involved, but if you read his book, you would think he saved Lucknow by himself. But yes, it was Lucknow Kavanagh. I think for me, he's one of those characters who symbolizes a little bit of what Lucknow was about. Yeah, he wasn't going to give up. He was very much daring do. He was everywhere. I mean, the man was down mines. He was organizing the volunteers. He was volunteering for sorties. He was just this one-man army. So it was not surprising that he's the one who decided to volunteer and bring the dispatches to Sir Colin Campbell. Yeah. And one has to imagine that Kavanagh was a very tall Irishman with red hair and big blue eyes. He's got himself all geared up in clothes of some description, and he's going to try and pass himself off as an Indian. Yeah, he was extremely lucky he got away with it.
Yeah, that's the man there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely is quite. It's obviously towards the end of the book, and it is quite a enjoyable story, if you like to end on. So, so you touched on it as well there about the civilian aspect of this. So firstly with the men, the male civilians. So how about the ones that were took up arms and did their bit, basically? They volunteered to fight.
Well, there was quite a wide variety of civilians available in Lucknow, and they were of different nationalities. One also has to remember this wasn't only civilians were not only British. They were also people from Italy. There were Germans. There was a Swiss man. There was French, and they were all there on business. They were doing many different things. There was Mr. Bersoletti, who was an alabaster salesman. I mean, he was selling alabaster figurines in Lucknow. I mean, how bizarre is that? Yeah. Mr. Rees, who had actually been a teacher at the Martinia School, but was there on business in Lucknow, looking after a consignment of rapeseed. So, there was a variety of civilians, and not all of them had a military background. In fact, very few of them did. They were clerks, they were writers, they were writers in the sense of they were people who wrote reports in duplicate and triplicate for others. They had a very tedious job. There were people associated with the newspaper. There were people associated with the banks, with the press, so a wide variety of civilians at very different ages. There were very young men like Rees. There were very old men who also tried to do their bit. And there was one fellow named Mr. Marshall who had just managed his final move of his career as an opium dealer, as in consignments of opium, not a street dealer. He was, really looking to sell the stuff on a commercial scale. And he died a terrible end. He was shot and he died, but he did his bit. But he was not interested in fighting. He was there to secure his consignments, and that's pretty much what all the volunteers were up to. I mean, Kavanagh has a lovely title for them. He calls them the Knights of the Quill. Yeah. And he tries to put his Knights of the Quill together into a fighting force. Yeah. The men who could ride horses became part of the volunteer cavalry. They served at Chinhatton. They did a brilliant job there, but there were only 30 of them. The ones who could shoot straight, well, they were out there with their muskets and they were being taught how to shoot a little bit better. Some of them found they had a great talent for the artillery, so they threw them in there with the big guns. So the volunteers served a tremendous purpose in the residency. They really left their mark on the place. Without them, they would not have been possible. And they, as I said, they were men of many different nationalities, and some of them were not. Some of them were not. They were not into this. This was not their fight. There was a German fellow who practically revolted. He didn't even want to be there. Mr. Rees was from Switzerland. This was not his fight, but he had nowhere else to go. And one has to imagine that poor fellow had just come from Kanpur. If he'd stayed 3 days longer, he would have never made it to Lucknow. So he was extremely lucky as to where he was. And then there were the teachers from the school, trying to keep their boys alive. So a wide variety of civilians available.
Yeah. So on the subject of the school, so obviously they played a part as well, and I think one of the quotes from the book is that they wanted it. There was a taste of revenge at one point. How about that?
Well, yes, that was the boys from the Martinia School. The Martinia College is still there, and it's a beautiful place to go and visit. It's a tremendously interesting building. The boys have been brought over. Initially, they'd intended to fortify the school and keep it as a defensive position, but Henry Lawrence decided this is ridiculous. The school was too far away, and he didn't have the manpower to keep the school as a defensive position. So all the boys were brought over to the residency, and they were given a house to fortify and to defend. Now we have to imagine this was 50 schoolboys, ranging from the ages of 7 to 17. The older boys were given guns. And the little boys, well, they were off, fanning the wounded in the hospitals. They were messengers. They were bringing ammunition. They were running around through the trenches. And yes, there was a taste for revenge. I mean, this was when one of their number had actually been shot or injured. And Edward Hilton and his friends decided, well, we're going to go and show that fellow up there on the tower what we're made of. So they decided to try and take a pot shot at a very, very experienced sniper. And well, they got it wrong and he nearly killed them. So, but for them, the worst thing was, besides one of their friends being injured, was looking out at this tremendous patch of vegetables that they couldn't get to. So the boys, being boys, happily spent a few hours shooting at pumpkins. A grand waste of ammunition, but they decided if we can't eat it, they can't either. so the boys of Martinia, they were a little bit a small force to be reckoned with of their own. They actually defended their house on their own for the first few weeks with their teachers. Their teachers, and with very little support. Then some men from the 32nd came and helped them out, but they were there. They were doing sentry duty. They were out there with their guns and they were defending their post. These were not, we do look at them as schoolboys, but I think they were a little bit more than just schoolboys. These were boys who were put through a tremendous lesson at a very early age. So and they all came out alive, except I believe only one died, but he died of illness and not of injury. Their principal kept them clean and tidy and fed them on what he could, and they actually all came out skinny, but in reasonable shape. So they were lucky.
Yeah, well, they definitely proved their worth and came of age in some senses. So finally, then the last people that we've not discussed yet are of course the women. Obviously, many of them were wives of some of the defenders there, and what about those?
Well, the women of Lucknow are pretty much divided into two different categories. There's the ladies, the wives of officers, the wives of doctors, the women who left behind accounts of their experiences, and there's several. And then there's the women that nobody speaks about, and those are the women of the regiments. the women of the men of the 32nd, the women who spent pretty much the entire siege in a basement in the dark, coming up from time to time for a little bit of air. Yeah. And they're the ones who didn't leave behind any accounts. They're the ones that you see a little bit in some of the books where they show up as, washerwomen, or they show up as nursemaids, or they show up as assistants in the hospital, but they're never named. These are the women that no one mentions. They're there, but they're not named. They're not visible. But one should also remember that they also played their part. The ones that didn't leave anything behind are the ones we always forget first. But the women of Lucknow were quite a set themselves. Many of them were widowed during the siege, or they became widows during the siege. They lost their husbands. Emily Polehampton's husband was the preacher. He was shot, and then he died of cholera, which was very unfortunate. But then she became a nurse at the hospital. There's Lady Inglis, of course, who is the brigadier's wife. She leaves behind a very interesting account, and of course, she had the best of the best. Yeah, there was different ranks of people in the residency. They were not above their own social prejudices. So some people did have more, and some people had way less. Some of the ladies got by very well. They had their food, they had their tea. But other women like Kate Bartram, who had arrived from Gondar with absolutely nothing except a little baby in her arms, she was trying to cut up, beef with nail scissors, because she had nothing else. She was trying to, it was the first time in her life she was trying to learn how to make a fire, and using sticks, which had previously been part of the railings around the residency, she was using them to kindle her fire. And her main goal in life was to keep her child alive. And those are many of the aspects, is that a lot of the children in the residency, many of them died of disease, and some of them simply died of starvation. Their mothers could no longer feed them. There was no milk to be had. The lucky ones got milk, the unlucky ones didn't. And some of those babies simply wasted away. They died because there was nothing to sustain them with. I mean, you cannot feed a newborn on sago root. It just doesn't work. And when the mother is dead, as it did happen, those babies simply starved. And one of them, the one that always stands out is the family of Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark survived, but his whole family died in the residency. He wasn't even there. He was way out somewhere else, trying to get there to save his family. Only when he arrived, he found they were all dead. And his wife had given birth to their daughter. She died, and then the baby died a few days later, and his son just wasted away. So he came back to find nothing. There was no happy reunion for Mr. Clark. And that's what happened a lot in the residency. People expecting to see that relative or that face or that child, and there was no one there anymore. And they're laying all there in the residency cemetery somewhere, with no one really to, there was nothing to mourn. And when Clark arrived, his family had been buried in a common grave. He didn't have any place to mourn. And that's kind of the human tragedy of it.
Yeah, no, very different times, and as you said, either the people behind the ruins and the rubble, really, and what remains now. This is the bit we need to remember. Is this bit?
Exactly.
So,
yeah. Give them a little bit of a. I wouldn't say it's not just a memorial to them. One kind of has to see the residency and all of its aspects, but they do form a part of it. It's the human tragedy, and we shouldn't look at them as as the invading army. This is not the point of it. The point of it is more along the lines of these were human beings. These were women and children who were caught up in a horrific situation, and through no real fault of their own. They were there, and they had to do what they could as best as they could. But but that's actually the human cost of what Lucknow was. Yeah.
Definitely. I'm just going to put the audience on notice. So if you've got any questions that you want to type in, please do so now. I've got a couple of other questions I'm just going to put to Eva, and then I'm going to switch over to yours. So just to put you on notice. So um, I guess one of the things which so before we started speaking, Eva, we'd seen your blog, and you're very active on social media. Do you want to say a little bit about that side of things?
Right. Well, my blog is called Mutiny Reflections. It's on WordPress. The blog is actually initially started as only about Lucknow, but I decided over time to expand it. And now it basically, the ambition of the blog is to cover the entire mutiny from day one right up to the very bitter end. I have not quite made it out of 1857 yet, but nearly, I'm nearly there, nearly there. But what I'm trying to do is cover all the small battles, all the small insurrections throughout India, especially in the mutiny area. So currently I just completed a section on the Punjab, where there were, various isolated outbreaks. But the idea is to bring all of these under one roof. So when anybody needs a resource in regard to 1857 or the entire war, right down to 1859 when it finally finished, the idea is to provide that kind of a resource. And it also goes into a lot of the civilian aspects, the escapes, the how people fled, how they managed, the different sieges. Lucknow was not the only siege; there were many. A few, many is perhaps an exaggeration, but there was Agra, we have Kanpur, we have Ara. There was, of course, what was called the Siege of Delhi, but that's a bit of a misnomer because it was the other way around. They were being, yeah, yeah, they kind of didn't do so well there for the first few months. But so there are different places where things were happening, and the idea is to bring everything under one big hat and provide that kind of a resource. I mean, I go through quite a lot of detail with that as well, listing casualties, civilian and military. So a lot of work goes into this site. Yeah. And of course, my day-to-day update of what happened today on Twitter. I started that just because I thought it might interest someone. Yeah. But yeah, so it's the what happened today is usually up more or less every day. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you are very, very generous with your time in that sense of, there's so much information you're putting out there for people on either social media or on the blog, and yeah, it is fascinating. So, I mean, between obviously, keeping up with the demand for that, are you considering any other books at some point?
Yes, I am actually. I have one or two ideas kicking around. One of them is actually looking really more into detail of some of these absolutely amazing escapes that people had. Um, whether they went well or not is really quite the other question. But some of them were quite intriguing. I mean, one has to imagine this was India at the hottest time of the year, and you're fleeing from a terrible place into scrubland. Yeah. Without really much of an idea of whether you're going to be killed in the next minute or if the people who are coming towards you are actually going to help you. So some of these escapes were quite interesting and unfortunately not very much talked about. So I thought that might be a little bit more of an adventurous thing to write about. Or because the other option would be, of course, to look more into detail into the Lucknow Victoria crosses. But Victoria crosses have been done, and they've been done repeatedly. It would just be a matter of trying to figure out if I can bring something new to the table. Yeah. But yeah, there are
Yeah.
some ideas kicking around for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we look forward to wherever the road takes you in that sense. So, we've got a question that popped up earlier, so I'm just going to cover
Mhm.
that off, which was from Ryan. This is quite a detailed question. It's surprising how many of the besieged and embattled commanders during the mutiny are from the Irish Protestant ascendancy. For example, Lawrence, he was from Donegal and Derry. at Lucknow. Wheeler was from Tipperary, and he was at Cawnpore, etc. Given a somewhat embattled attitude at times in Ireland among this class, I was wondering if there is any sense of Lawrence's background influencing his thinking about the risks of the mutiny and the preparations for a potential siege, meaning he was better prepared than others.
Well, it's possible. There's always that possibility that them being from Ireland had an influence on them. But I think what influenced these men the most was their experience, their years and years and decades of experience in India itself. They had learned to read the country, and they were very astute readers of signs and portents, if one wants to look at it that way. They could see what was coming. I mean, the warning signs had been there already since the time of Charles Napier. I mean, Napier was shouting about it already in 1853. So, you know, things were on the horizon, and if people could see it, then they were already amply warned. The thing is, not everyone wanted to take it to heart, and not everybody wanted to see it. And unfortunately, even though we do talk a lot about Wheeler from Cawnpore during the mutiny, the problem is Wheeler misjudged the situation. So it was a very tragic end for him, even in spite of all of his years and years of experience. But yes, perhaps being Irish did help. Yeah, there's a good chance that may have had very much something to do with it. You know, but they had spent most of their lives in India.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. We've got a couple of other questions come through so far. So from Catherine, hello, you mentioned the number of people who were involved at Lucknow and those who came through it. Kind of what's the rough split between military and civilian survivors in that sense?
Oh, that's difficult to say. I haven't gone into detail with that myself yet, because it's quite a twisted thing to try and take apart. I believe the percentage of women and children was relatively low as compared to the men. Most of the children didn't make it, especially the younger ones didn't make it. But I would actually have to look into that a little bit more, personally, a little bit more into detail. I don't actually have a split as such, but the men did have they had the upper hand on this one. They were better fed, you know, and they were certainly better at getting out of there than the ladies were. The ladies, they died in fairly large quantities. Yeah. So, but I can actually look into that, and if Catherine would like an absolutely detailed answer, I will probably be able to come up with it in a couple of days. So, and I'll put it on my blog. Yeah.
Okay, watch this space. And then another question from Jason was, have you thought of leading a tour of the residency and some of the other mutiny sites?
I have actually thought about it, but if anybody has any ideas of how to put this together, I'm on board. No problem, for sure. I would love to do that. I mean, I've had that idea kicking around for some time. Lucknow would be great fun to do. Kanpur would be very interesting, and of course, there's Delhi. I mean, you know, who can miss Delhi? You know, one would definitely have to do Delhi as well. So yeah, for sure, I would like to do something like that. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, if anyone on here or watching this on demand can lay that on for us, you know, please get in touch. Eva obviously is on social media, so you can get in contact with her or relay it through us, and we'll make sure it gets to her. So, you know, I for one would definitely be interested. So, right. So, if anyone else, any call for final questions? Anyone? If anyone wants to come off mic, off mute, sorry, and say them, that's fine. Or if you pop it in chat. Okay, I'm going to take the silence. So yeah, so obviously thanks Eva. Honestly, I think this has probably been my favorite talk so far. I think we've been able to go into so much depth. You know, you're clearly, you know, this subject inside out, and it really does show in what you've achieved tonight. So thank you for that. And obviously have to plug the book, goes without saying. So here's my copy, which you can buy either on our website So if you have a look on there, if you want to support an independent publisher, it's www.barnformpublishing.co.uk, or of course the ever-present Amazon. You can find it on there. If you're watching this in India or a country that may not be one of the Amazon KDP kind of favorites, please don't be disheartened. Send us an email and we will see what we can do about getting a copy to you. We just have to work our way around Amazon's systems. So yeah, with that, again, thank you very much everyone for attending and for taking part. And yeah, have a good evening and we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.